Commissioner Gordon, Bane has escaped.
Transformation begins in the shadows long before it shows in the mirror. The shift happens the moment you realize your old life was built on compromises you never agreed to. You start to see the quiet manipulations of comfort, the invisible chains of habit, the subtle lies you tell yourself to avoid confrontation with your own potential. The mind resists change because change threatens the identity it has spent years protecting. To evolve, you must dismantle that identity piece by piece and replace every assumption with intent. Nothing about this process is clean or graceful. It is a psychological demolition where the demolition crew and the architect are the same person. The work is brutal, silent, and profoundly liberating. This is where the path begins for those ready to shape themselves with precision. Every reinvention demands a psychological death, not the poetic kind. The real kind. The kind where your biases are dragged into the light and questioned without mercy. The version of you that survived yesterday cannot lead you into tomorrow. That former self is hesitant, fragile, addicted to repetition, and allergic to conflict. To outgrow it, you must be willing to confront the darkest corners of your character. You must step into the mental arena where your excuses stand in formation, guarding the gates of your comfort zone. Winning that battle requires clarity sharper than fear. The moment you stop flinching from your truth, the structure of your personality begins to shift from the inside outward. The subconscious carries the instructions for your life. Buried memories, learned fears, old definitions of who you thought you were. These fragments operate like hidden programs shaping every reaction, expectation, and limitation. Transforming yourself requires hacking into those programs and rewriting them line by line. This is not a gentle process. The subconscious protects itself fiercely. It pushes back with resistance disguised as fatigue, confusion, or emotional fog. But once you learn to observe these internal reactions without obeying them, the grip loosens. You begin updating the system instead of being controlled by it. This psychological rewrite is the true turning point. Identity shifts create psychological tension because the brain wants consistency even when that consistency destroys you. The moment you act differently from your history, your mind sends alarms trying to pull you back into the familiar. This is where most people retreat. They mistake discomfort for danger, but discomfort is the signal of expansion. If you push through the initial panic, the brain recalibrates. It begins forming new associations, new habits, new expectations. You reshape your worldview through repeated defiance of your former limitations. That defiance is the engine of transformation. It has a silent cruelty to it. You start noticing the lies you believed for years. You begin seeing how people around you benefited from your smaller self. You realize how much potential you traded for acceptance, predictability, and ease. This realization cuts deeper than any external criticism ever could, but the pain is productive. It is the psychological rupture required for growth. Once you see the truth, you cannot return to ignorance. You outgrow relationships, environments, and versions of yourself that never truly honored who you could become. Growth demands isolation, because isolation removes the mirrors that once defined you. When the world stops reflecting your old identity back at you, the mind becomes free to rebuild. In the quiet, you confront your real motivations without distraction. You strip away personas, masks, and narratives. You find the raw blueprint underneath the noise. That blueprint becomes your foundation. From there, you construct a new internal hierarchy built on intention rather than imitation. The person emerging in that silence is not a copy of who you were. It is a controlled creation of who you choose to be. There is a dark edge to self-mastery, You begin treating your impulses as rivals, not rulers. You notice the childish tantrum of craving comfort. You see the subtle manipulation of your emotional brain trying to bargain its way out of effort. You learn to watch your thoughts like an intruder watches a rival's movements. You respond with discipline instead of indulgence. This separation of identity from instinct is the psychological split that produces power. You become the strategist of your own evolution rather than the servant of your impulses. It also reveals the real enemy, not failure, not difficulty, not fear. The enemy is passiveness, the slow rot of unchallenged days, the subtle erosion of potential through repetition without intention. The longer you move without purpose, the more your ambition atrophies. Breaking that cycle requires a decisive shift in daily behavior. You begin structuring your life around priorities rather than moods. You act with focus even when motivation is absent. You build momentum through consistency rather than emotion. Over time, the new behaviors crystallize into character. Reinvention requires confrontation with the past. Every unresolved disappointment, every avoided truth, every unspoken desire. You cannot build a new life on unfinished business. Transformation requires closing psychological tabs so your mind stops looping back to what no longer matters. When you release the emotional weight of your history, the internal system finally has the bandwidth to construct a future. What once felt like heaviness becomes fuel. What once felt like regret becomes direction. Your emotional architecture shifts from reaction to creation. Identity is the mind's fortress, built from years of repetition, emotional memory, and familiar patterns. Even when those patterns damage your progress, the brain clings to them because familiarity feels safer than possibility. This is the paradox at the core of self-transformation. Your mind would rather keep you in a life that hurts than expose you to a life that is uncertain. That is why the first step of evolution feels like betrayal. You are not just abandoning habits, you are dismantling a psychological home your brain spent years constructing. The resistance you feel is not failure. It is the mind defending its territory. It will weaponize fear, doubt, and distraction to protect what it knows. Transformation begins the moment you stop believing that those signals are truth and start recognizing them as alarms triggered by change. When you break that defense, you reclaim control over the blueprint of who you are becoming. That is where the dark psychology of self-transformation starts cutting through the illusion. A mind anchored in old identity cannot imagine a future outside its limitations. It has collected evidence for years that reinforces your current patterns. Every setback becomes proof that you are better off staying the same. Every disappointment becomes a reason to avoid risk. Every small success becomes an excuse to settle. The brain functions like a biased historian documenting only what supports its story. Changing that story requires disrupting the archive. You must introduce new experiences that contradict the old narrative. You must create proof that a different life is possible. At first, the mind rejects this proof the same way the body rejects foreign material. But repetition rewires belief. Slowly, the subconscious stops fighting change and starts participating in it. This shift marks the first break in the wall you weren't supposed to climb. Comfort zones are psychological cages painted to look like sanctuaries. They offer predictability, not peace. They offer familiarity, not fulfillment. The brain stays loyal to them because survival mechanisms prioritize safety over satisfaction. This is why transformation feels unnatural. You are asking the mind to abandon the very patterns it believes kept you alive. The brain interprets your growth as a threat because growth requires uncertainty, and uncertainty activates ancient fear circuits. If you understand this, you stop mistaking resistance for truth. You begin pushing through discomfort, knowing it is simply the brain trying to keep you inside a shrinking world. Your job is not to argue with those signals. Your job is to override them through consistent action. When you attempt to change, the mind reacts the same way a failing ruler reacts to a rebellion. It tightens its grip. It brings old habits to the surface. It sends emotional storms designed to make you retreat. It paints vivid memories of comfort to lure you back. The mind does not fear the new version of you, it fears losing the old one. That fear is why transformation requires psychological violence, not against yourself, but against the outdated identity that refuses to step aside. You must strip authority from the past self and place it into the emerging one. Only then does change stop feeling like a threat and start feeling like liberation. The brain builds identity through repetition. Whatever you do often becomes who you think you are. This is why changing identity requires new behavior, not new motivation. You cannot think your way into a new self while behaving like the old one. The mind uses your actions as evidence of identity. If your behavior stays the same, your identity stays the same. When you act differently, your brain experiences cognitive dissonance, a clash between your history and your evolution. This discomfort is the birthplace of transformation. You push through until the new behavior becomes familiar and the identity that once fought you begins to support you. The mind confuses comfort with truth. If something feels familiar, the brain assumes it is right. If something feels unfamiliar, the brain assumes it is dangerous. This bias is a survival instinct, not a guideline for growth. Most people live trapped because they treat the brain's fear responses as wisdom. Transformation happens when you begin treating fear as information instead. You analyze it, you decode it, you question it. You stop giving emotional storms the authority to decide your future. Once fear loses its role as a compass, the path forward becomes clearer. The brain adjusts to new patterns, and fear becomes fuel rather than a barrier. Breaking identity defenses requires brutal honesty. You must pinpoint the moments your mind manipulated you into staying small. You must confront the excuses you used as shields. You must examine the stories you inherited from family, culture, and past experiences. Many of these stories were never yours, yet you built your entire life around them. The brain holds onto these inherited scripts because rewriting them demands effort, awareness, and emotional confrontation. But the moment you challenge them, the foundation begins to crack. The old identity loses its authority. A new internal narrative starts taking shape. Transformation requires repetition that outlasts resistance. You must repeat new behaviors until the brain accepts them as the new normal. The brain adapts through repetition, not force. The first attempts feel unnatural. The second attempts feel uncomfortable. The third attempts feel possible. Eventually, the brain rewires itself around your new actions. This process is slow, frustrating, and mentally taxing, and that is precisely why it works. The brain bonds to what it experiences most often. If you want to change who you are, you must make the new identity the most repeated pattern in your life. The psychological battle intensifies when you get close to change. Right before a breakthrough, the mind often launches its strongest resistance. Old habits return with unexpected power. Distractions multiply. Motivation collapses. This is not regression. This is the brain's final attempt to protect its territory. The enemy always fights hardest when it is dying. Push through this stage and the identity shifts permanently. The internal war ends not with a dramatic moment, but with quiet stability. The new self becomes the default. When an identity collapses, the chemistry collapses with it. The brain loses the familiar loops that once produced predictable spikes of reward. Habits, routines, emotional patterns Even the narratives you used to justify your life all carried their own dopamine signatures. When you cut them away, the baseline drops. The mind enters quiet terrain it does not recognize. This emptiness often terrifies people because it feels like nothingness, but that nothingness is the absence of addiction to the old self. It is the pause between who you were and who you are becoming. There is no script, no pattern, no emotional autopilot. The brain is not punishing you, it is resetting. This is a rare psychological window where the slate clears and the noise dies. In that silence, something new has space to grow. Sit in it, listen to it, let it stretch you. The dark psychology of self-transformation demands that you learn to breathe inside the void instead of running back to the person you left behind. The crash after identity death confuses many because they misunderstand withdrawal from familiarity as emotional decline. When the dopamine loops of the past break, the brain temporarily loses its sense of direction. Old habits do not fire. Old motivations do not rise. Old excitement disappears. What remains is a clean mental landscape, raw and uncolored by previous patterns. Most people panic here. They reach for distractions, cling to comfort, or resurrect the identity they worked so hard to escape. But the void is not an enemy. It is a transition chamber. It is the psychological equivalent of molten metal, where your personality is reduced to its most basic form, so it can be reshaped. If you learn to stay still in this state without numbing it, a new purpose begins assembling itself quietly. This territory belongs only to those willing to let their old life die fully. Purpose does not appear during noise. It appears when the mind is quiet enough to recognize what it truly wants. The temporary emptiness after identity shedding strips away the illusions that once dictated your ambition. You stop chasing what others chase. You stop performing for imaginary audiences. You stop seeking validation from patterns that drained you. With the dopamine baseline low, the brain stops rewarding shortcuts and superficial desires. In this moment, it finally becomes sensitive to deeper signals. Things that once excited you feel hollow. Things you once ignored now whisper with unusual clarity. This shift is not depression, it is recalibration. The system is searching for a new hierarchy of meaning. Let it search. This is the birth pang of reinvention. The void becomes fertile when you stop resisting it. People often escape the emptiness because they believe life is supposed to feel constantly stimulated, but stimulation was part of the old identity. It kept you distracted, predictable, and dependent on familiar loops. When the brain stops feeding you those automatic highs, your nervous system begins detoxing from the noise you never realized controlled you. This detox leaves you restless, uncertain, and stripped of false desires. This is where clarity grows. This is where deeper intelligence awakens. This is where your mind becomes capable of seeing beyond the surface rewards that shaped your former life. Sit with the silence long enough and the silence begins speaking. As the dopamine baseline rebuilds itself, the brain searches for new meaning to anchor your evolving identity. This search happens beneath awareness. The prefrontal cortex begins scanning your experiences, your values, your future visions, and your untapped instincts. It evaluates what deserves long-term investment and what no longer fits the path ahead. This neural negotiation creates new motivational circuits. The emptiness you feel is simply the space required for this reprogramming to occur. Rushing to fill the void with distractions interrupts the process. Allowing the void to exist accelerates it. Every day you sit without running restores the system with cleaner motivation. The void also reveals attachments you did not realize were addictions. You start noticing how much your old identity relied on stimulation, validation, and emotional loops. You realize how many of your desires were conditioned reactions rather than authentic aims. Without the constant dopamine spikes, you are forced to confront your real motivations. Some dissolve, others expand. The ones that expand are the seeds of your next evolution. They are not loud, glamorous, or intoxicating. They are quiet, grounded, and persistent. These are the desires worth building a life around. The void purifies ambition by burning away the illusions. Transformation deepens when you stop interpreting emptiness as failure. The nervous system always drops into stillness before rising into strength. This is the same chemistry behind recovery in athletes, adaptation in emotional resilience, and breakthrough in creative minds. You are experiencing the psychological equivalent of muscle fatigue. The system is exhausted from holding the old identity together and needs this pause to stabilize. The danger lies in misreading the pause as a sign that you made the wrong choice. You didn't. You simply entered the space where your old identity cannot accompany you, and your new one has not fully formed. Stay here long enough, and the new self begins to gather momentum. Purpose requires a clean slate, because the mind cannot build a new life on the emotional residue of the previous one. The crash clears away motivations rooted in insecurity, fear, and imitation. It forces you to stop acting out of habit and start acting from intention. Without automatic dopamine rewards, your choices become more conscious. This is where self-honesty becomes unavoidable. You cannot lie to yourself inside the void. The silence exposes everything, and in that exposure, you discover what deserves your next chapter. The void is the space where false desires die and real ones are born. The emptiness you feel is the threshold of psychological rebirth. It is not comfortable, and it is not meant to be. It is the mind shedding its old skin. The new baseline will not feel like the old one. It will feel calmer, cleaner, and quieter. This quietness is the foundation of purpose. Purpose does not emerge from excitement. It emerges from clarity, and clarity can only arise when the mind is free from the noise of the identity it has buried. The void is not a pause in transformation. It is the core of transformation. The subconscious is the silent empire beneath your awareness, governing nearly every action before your conscious mind even has time to think. It stores patterns, beliefs, memories, traumas, and routines like a vast underground machine that never stops running. When people talk about change, they aim at the conscious mind, the small fraction of thought they can see. But real transformation requires descending into the unseen machinery below. You cannot talk your way into a new life. You cannot repeat mantras and expect your identity to shift. The subconscious does not listen to language. It listens to repetition and proof. Every behavior you perform becomes a vote. Every habit becomes a signal. Every small win becomes data the subconscious uses to update the blueprint of who you are. Transformation begins where evidence accumulates, not where motivation begins. The dark psychology of self-transformation rests on this truth. The subconscious obeys patterns, not promises. You can promise yourself that you will change. You can imagine a better version of yourself. You can say it aloud every morning. But if your actions contradict your words, the subconscious sides with what you do, not what you say. It reinforces the identity tied to your behavior, not your intention. That is why change feels impossible for people who rely on affirmation alone. The subconscious has years of evidence supporting the old identity, and it will not abandon that identity because you whispered a sentence into the mirror. You must give it new proof that carries emotional weight, proof that disrupts old expectations, proof that makes the subconscious question the continuity of your former self. Without evidence, nothing rewires. Reprogramming the subconscious demands consistency because consistency creates authority. When you repeat a small action enough times, the subconscious begins assuming that action is part of who you are.